This is a very special episode about a very special place. This is Yellowstone National Park. These are its geysers, hot springs, and mud pots. And they are some of the best windows into the past that we have anywhere on Earth. I'm here with MinuteEarth. A few years ago, a team of scientists started drilling deep into the Earth here. They wanted to see what kinds of microbes they could find living in these extreme environments. But as it turns out, there's not only microbes living in these scalding waters, but fossils too. See, these geothermal features are basically time capsules that preserve ancient life exceptionally well. And so far, the team has found fossils of single-celled organisms, bacteria, dating back almost 900 million years. That means these organisms were alive before the first complex animals evolved, before plants and fungi took over land, before any of us were around. Yellowstone isn't the only place where we've discovered this ancient life. We've also found similar fossils in places like Western Australia, which is why researchers think these super-old bacteria might be part of a global phenomenon. It's just that Yellowstone's bacteria are exceptionally well preserved. So it's one of the best places for figuring out how life on Earth began and what it was like for hundreds of millions of years. To understand how this incredible preservation happens, we need to take a journey to the past ourselves. Let's go back in time to when our solar system was just a bunch of spinning dust and gas. Over millions of years, gravity caused bits of matter to collide and stick together, slowly growing larger and larger until boom, a new rocky planet, Earth, was born. Now Earth had oceans, volcanoes, and an atmosphere, but no life. Then, zap, a meteor packed with organic molecules, including some building blocks of life, crashed into Earth. Some of these molecules made their way into the ocean where they combined and replicated, creating the first self-sustaining cells, the first life on Earth. For the next 600 million years, life was mostly limited to the oceans. Then, starting around 540 million years ago, animals began to crawl up on land, and photosynthesizers moved into newly formed forests. Meanwhile, Earth's continents were moving, colliding, and splitting apart, which caused massive extinctions and reshaped the planet's surface. For example, 252 million years ago, there was a mass extinction that wiped out more than 90% of marine species and many terrestrial vertebrates. Scientists aren't totally sure what caused this mass extinction, but they think it may have been related to massive volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia. As the eruptions continued for 1 million years, they released huge amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, triggering global warming and ocean acidification, which would have devastated lots of living things. And yet life on Earth did not end. Instead, small animals and plants kept dividing, eventually giving rise to all the complex life we see around us today, including us. In other words, all life on land can trace its roots back to those survivors, which makes the story of life on land to date a story of resilience in the face of major disruptions. Except finding fossils of these ancient creatures is pretty tough because over time, rocks containing their fossils get worn away by wind and water or buried and then uncovered by more sediment, leaving behind an incomplete record of early life. But in places like Yellowstone, fossils of microscopic organisms are remarkably intact because the conditions that have preserved them are still happening today. And those conditions begin with this. Yellowstone sits atop a hotspot, an area of unusually high volcanic activity. It's here that magma rises from deep within the Earth and creates new igneous rock which then pushes older rocks upward, exposing vast layers of rock that are usually hidden deep underground. The oldest exposed rocks are at least 17 million years old, while the youngest are less than 500,000. This means that Yellowstone is constantly creating a window into the past by revealing rocks that are hundreds of millions, even billions of years old. Take this rock, for example. Its mineral grains are so worn down that you can't tell one from another just by looking at it. We call this kind of rock metamorphic. And we know that it's at least 17 million years old because it's sitting on top of rock that is younger than that, but we don't know how much older because it's impossible to figure out how long it took for this rock to turn into this. In other words, we don't know how long these rocks spent being eroded before they were buried and turned into metamorphic rock. This lack of clarity makes it really hard to study the history of life on Earth because if we don't know how old the rocks are, we can't tell how old the fossils in them are. That's why it's so exciting that we can find such well-preserved fossils in Yellowstone's geothermal features. See, these features form when magma deep underground heats up groundwater, which turns into steam, creating pressure that pushes water to the surface. As the water rises, it encounters layers of rock with different chemical properties. The hot water dissolves some minerals, creating a colorful concoction that often ends up seeping out in the form of a hot spring or a geyser. And depending on the chemistry of the water and the minerals involved, these geothermal features can be anywhere from a few feet to more than 300 feet across, and reach temperatures as high as 204 degrees Fahrenheit. Now these features don't just appear, they're part of a hydrothermal system that forms over millions of years. Take this feature called a sinter terrace. Hot water seeps through cracks in the rock, cooling as it reaches the surface. When the water cools, dissolved minerals start falling out of solution, creating mounds that grow terrace by terrace. And because the water is so hot, it kills anything that gets too close. So instead of decomposing, nearby organisms get preserved in the terraces themselves. And because these features are always forming, they contain fossils of very recent life. In fact, scientists have found living bacteria inside Yellowstone's hot springs. In other words, these geothermal features preserve a complete timeline of life, from ancient fossils to living organisms. It's just that most of the time they're not preserving in a form that we can actually study. That's because once organisms die and get buried in a hot spring, they're quickly surrounded by minerals and turned into rock. We call this process permineralization, and because permineralized fossils are so heavy, they don't often make it into the fossil record. Instead, they stay locked up in the rocks. But in Yellowstone's hot springs, there's another process that keeps fossils intact, and that's silica deposition. See, hot springs release dissolved silica, which falls out of solution as the water cools. And sometimes this silica builds up around cells, forming a kind of protective cast. Silica is softer than the minerals typically used to make fossils, so it's easier to study. For example, we can cut thin sections of silica-encased bacteria and look at them under a microscope. And because we know exactly where and when the section came from, we can link what we're seeing to geological time. So by combining this rich fossil record with chemical analyses of the rocks, scientists hope to better understand how life on Earth got started and how it has changed over time. In fact, thanks to Yellowstone's silica encasing springs, we've already learned that life goes through changes when times get tough. In 2021, scientists analyzed a series of silica casts from Yellowstone's Norris Geyser Basin and compared the genetic information contained within to the ages of the silica. What they found was that between 11,600 and 8,600 years ago, the bacteria went through a rough patch. It seems that during this period, the amount of silica and water in the basin changed dramatically, probably due to volcanic activity. And these changes created an environment that favored a smaller, simpler form of bacteria. But after 3,000 years, the environment returned to normal and the more complex bacteria that we see today were able to thrive again. It's stories like this that researchers hope to uncover more of in Yellowstone's geothermal features. They're planning to drill more wells, collect more samples, and continue pushing back the clock to learn more about life's origins and history. Who knows? Maybe they'll even discover the very first life on Earth.